Picture this: a former banker sitting in their home office, staring at spreadsheets filled with numbers that don't add up. Not by thousands, not by millions, but by billions. They've discovered something that could shake America's largest bank to its foundation, a scheme so intricate that it allowed JPMorgan Chase to quietly pocket billions while violating federal rules designed to prevent another financial catastrophe like the one that nearly destroyed the global economy in 2008. This isn't fiction, this is happening right now, and what you're about to discover will fundamentally change how you view the banking system. Before we dive deeper into this explosive revelation, if you want to stay informed about financial scandals that mainstream media often overlooks, hit that subscribe button and tap the notification bell. Drop a like if you believe in financial transparency and accountability. Your support helps us bring you these critical investigations. Now, let's unpack the biggest banking scandal you probably haven't heard about yet. The story begins in August 2023 when a 35-page letter landed on the desk of JPMorgan Chase's Board Audit Committee. Written by a former JPMorgan banker, this wasn't just another corporate complaint. This was a detailed expose of how America's largest financial institution, with assets totaling $4.6 trillion as of June 2025, had been systematically gaming the system. The whistleblower alleged that JPMorgan had been deliberately misrepresenting key financial indicators to the Federal Reserve, making the bank appear less risky and complex than it actually was. The payoff was massive, allowing JPMorgan to hold less capital in reserve and generate an additional $2 billion in net income in just 1 year alone. To understand what's really happening here, we need to go back to the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis. When the global economy nearly collapsed, governments around the world spent hundreds of billions of dollars to bail out failing banks. American taxpayers alone contributed approximately $700 billion through the Troubled Asset Relief Program. In the wake of that disaster, global regulators created a framework called Basel III. These were international banking standards designed to ensure that the world's largest financial institutions, the ones deemed too big to fail, would hold enough capital to survive future crises without requiring government bailouts. The goal was simple: never again should ordinary citizens be forced to rescue reckless banks. The Federal Reserve, America's central banking system, adopted these Basel III standards and created what's known as the Global Systemically Important Bank Surcharge, or GSIB surcharge. Think of this as an insurance policy. The bigger and more complex a bank is, the more capital it must keep in reserve. This extra cushion of money is meant to absorb losses during economic downturns, preventing the kind of catastrophic failures we saw in 2008. JPMorgan Chase sits at the very top of this list. Among all American banks, JPMorgan faces the highest capital requirements because it poses the greatest risk to the financial system. Here's where the whistleblower's allegations become critical. Part of determining how much extra capital a bank must hold depends on measuring its complexity. The more complex a bank's operations, the higher its GSIB surcharge, meaning more money sitting idle in reserves instead of being deployed for profit-generating activities. The Federal Reserve uses specific indicators to measure this complexity, and one crucial metric involves how banks report their trading activities. Banks often hold both long positions, which make money when asset prices rise, and short positions, which profit when prices fall. A bank might own securities worth $5 billion, while simultaneously betting against related securities worth $3 billion. The story begins in August 2023 when a 35-page letter landed on the desk of JPMorgan Chase's Board Audit Committee. Written by a former JPMorgan banker, this wasn't just another corporate complaint. This was a detailed expose of how America's largest financial institution, with assets totaling $4.6 trillion as of June 2025, had been systematically gaming the system. The whistleblower alleged that JPMorgan had been deliberately misrepresenting key financial indicators to the Federal Reserve, making the bank appear less risky and complex than it actually was. The payoff was massive, allowing JPMorgan to hold less capital in reserve and generate an additional $2 billion in net income in just 1 year alone. To understand what's really happening here, we need to go back to the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis. When the global economy nearly collapsed, governments around the world spent hundreds of billions of dollars to bail out failing banks. American taxpayers alone contributed approximately $700 billion through the Troubled Asset Relief Program. In the wake of that disaster, global regulators created a framework called Basel III. These were international banking standards designed to ensure that the world's largest financial institutions, the ones deemed too big to fail, would hold enough capital to survive future crises without requiring government bailouts. The goal was simple: Never again should ordinary citizens be forced to rescue reckless banks. The Federal Reserve, America's central banking system, adopted these Basel III standards and created what's known as the Global Systemically Important Bank Surcharge, or GSIB surcharge. Think of this as an insurance policy. The bigger and more complex a bank is, the more capital it must keep in reserve. This extra cushion of money is meant to absorb losses during economic downturns, preventing the kind of catastrophic failures we saw in 2008. JPMorgan Chase sits at the very top of this list. Among all American banks, JPMorgan faces the highest capital requirements because it poses the greatest risk to the financial system. Here's where the whistleblower's allegations become critical. Part of determining how much extra capital a bank must hold depends on measuring its complexity. The more complex a bank's operations, the higher its GSIB surcharge, meaning more money sitting idle in reserves instead of being deployed for profit-generating activities. The Federal Reserve uses specific indicators to measure this complexity, and one crucial metric involves how banks report their trading activities. Banks often hold both long positions, which make money when asset prices rise, and short positions, which profit when prices fall. A bank might own securities worth $5 billion while simultaneously betting against related securities worth $3 billion. The total gross exposure is $8 billion, even though the net exposure might only be $2 billion. International banking standards and Federal Reserve rules specifically prohibit what's called netting when calculating complexity indicators. Netting means offsetting long and short positions to report only the net figure. Why is netting prohibited? Because a bank holding offsetting positions is fundamentally more complex than a bank with no positions at all, even if the net exposure appears identical. Complexity isn't just about net risk, it's about the intricate web of positions that could unravel during market stress. During a financial crisis, you can't simply cancel out positions. Markets can freeze, counterparties can fail. What looks balanced on paper can quickly become chaos in reality. This is why regulators demand gross reporting, not net reporting, for these specific complexity measurements. According to the whistleblower, JPMorgan Chase found a creative workaround. The bank allegedly implemented something called internal operational elimination. JPMorgan claimed this practice didn't constitute prohibited netting. The whistleblower disagrees, calling this interpretation nonsensical. In their detailed 35-page letter, the former banker argues that internal operational elimination is functionally identical to netting. It's just dressed up in different terminology. By using this accounting technique, JPMorgan could report lower complexity scores to the Federal Reserve. Lower complexity scores meant lower capital requirements. Lower capital requirements meant JPMorgan could deploy more money into lending and investment activities. And more deployment meant more profits. The numbers are staggering. The whistleblower calculated that by understating its complexity, JPMorgan Chase was able to issue an additional $75 billion to $100 billion in loans. Let that sink in for a moment. We're not talking about pocket change. We're talking about nearly $100 billion in additional lending capacity that theoretically shouldn't have been available if the bank had reported its complexity correctly according to international standards. This extra lending capacity translated into approximately $2 billion in additional net income in just 1 year. $2 billion. That's the profit potentially generated from what the whistleblower alleges was a violation of Federal Reserve rules and international banking standards. But the rabbit hole goes deeper. The whistleblower isn't alleging that JPMorgan is the only institution engaging in this practice. According to the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, which broke this story in January 2025, another former JPMorgan banker who moved to a different major U.S. bank confirmed that other large financial institutions subject to GSIB surcharges have adopted similar policies. This isn't just one bad apple. This might be a systemic problem affecting multiple too-big-to-fail banks across America. The implications are genuinely terrifying. If multiple major banks are understating their complexity, they're all holding less capital than they should. That capital buffer is what's supposed to protect the financial system during the next crisis. It's the lesson we supposedly learned from 2008. Graham Steele, a former assistant secretary for financial institutions at the U.S. Treasury Department, put it bluntly in an interview with the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. If U.S. banks don't have enough capital for times when they experience financial stress, that is putting their domestic economies at greater risk because it's eroding their ability to absorb losses. Think about what Steele is really saying here. The entire purpose of post-2008 financial reforms was to ensure banks could survive crises without taxpayer bailouts. But if banks are gaming the capital requirement calculations, we're right back where we started. The safety net we thought we had built might be full of holes. The Federal Reserve's response to these allegations has been notably restrained. When asked directly about whether the regulator allowed banks to report complexity indicators in the manner described by the whistleblower, a Federal Reserve spokesperson didn't answer the question. Instead, they pointed to the overall higher capital requirements that large U.S. banks face compared to their European counterparts and emphasized the advisory nature of international banking standards. The spokesperson told the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists that comparing how U.S. and European banks calculate their capital surcharge exposures is not a proper comparison. They noted that the largest and most complex U.S. banks are required under Fed rules to have substantially higher capital surcharges than their international counterparts and substantially higher capital surcharges than specified under the non-binding Basel Accord. Notice what the Federal Reserve didn't say. They didn't deny that banks are using internal operational elimination. They didn't confirm that this practice complies with the spirit of international standards. They simply argued that U.S. banks face higher overall requirements, so any comparison with international standards is misleading. This is a classic deflection technique. When confronted with specific allegations about potentially gaming complexity calculations, change the subject to overall capital levels. It's like being caught speeding and responding that you still have a valid driver's license. True, perhaps, but not really addressing the accusation. JPMorgan Chase, for its part, has been adamant in its denial. The bank issued a statement saying it is confident in its methodology, which is fully transparent to its regulators. JPMorgan insists it complies with all capital regulations, and that claims suggesting otherwise are false. Note the careful language here. The bank says its methodology is transparent to regulators and that it complies with all capital regulations, but transparency doesn't equal correctness. If JPMorgan disclosed its internal operational elimination approach to the Federal Reserve and the Fed chose not to challenge it, that's transparency. But it doesn't necessarily mean the practice aligns with the intent of international banking standards that prohibit netting for complexity calculations. The timing of this whistleblower revelation is particularly significant. In 2023 and 2024, the banking industry waged an aggressive lobbying campaign against proposed rules known as Basel Endgame. These rules would have significantly increased capital requirements for America's largest banks. The industry spent millions on billboard advertisements alongside major highways and Washington's Reagan National Airport. They aired commercials during Sunday Night Football warning that new capital rules would increase costs for working-class Americans. It was a full court press designed to convince politicians and the public that stronger capital requirements would hurt the economy, and the lobbying worked. In September 2024, the Federal Reserve dramatically revised its proposal. Originally, the Fed planned to increase capital requirements by 19% for large U.S. banks. After the industry pushback, that number dropped to just 9%. That's less than half the original proposal. The banking industry essentially cut its potential regulatory burden in half through lobbying. Michael Barr, the Federal Reserve's vice chairman for banking supervision, who had championed the stronger capital requirements, announced in January 2025 that he would step down from his position. This came after advisors to President Donald Trump considered efforts to demote him. The message was clear. Push for tougher bank regulations, and your career might suffer consequences. Now consider the context. While the banking industry was successfully lobbying against higher capital requirements, arguing they already held more than enough reserves, a whistleblower was simultaneously preparing allegations that banks might be understating their complexity to hold even less capital than current rules required. The cognitive dissonance is remarkable. Banks publicly claimed they were overcapitalized while potentially privately using accounting techniques to minimize those capital requirements. It's having your cake and eating it too. The whistleblower's journey to coming forward was itself a cautionary tale about corporate retaliation. According to their letter to JPMorgan's Board Audit Committee, they first raised concerns about the internal operational elimination practice with bank officials in 2018. That was 5 years before writing the formal whistleblower letter. For 5 years, this person tried to work within the system. And what happened? The whistleblower states they were ultimately retaliated against and laid off in 2022. This is becoming an unfortunately common pattern at JPMorgan Chase. Multiple whistleblowers have reported similar experiences. They identify serious problems, they report those problems through proper channels, and then they find themselves shown the exit door. This isn't just anecdotal. JPMorgan has a documented history of whistleblower issues. In January 2024, the Securities and Exchange Commission announced that JPMorgan Securities would pay an $18 million civil penalty for impeding hundreds of advisory clients and brokerage customers from reporting potential securities law violations to the SEC. Between March 2020 and July 2023, JPMorgan required at least 362 clients to sign confidential release agreements when receiving settlements or credits exceeding $1,000. These agreements specifically prohibited clients from voluntarily contacting the Securities and Exchange Commission about potential violations. Sure, the agreements said clients could respond if the SEC asked them questions, but they couldn't proactively report wrongdoing. It's the difference between answering when called and being allowed to make the call yourself. Corey Schuster, co-chief of the SEC's Enforcement Division Asset Management Unit, stated the obvious. Investors, whether retail or otherwise, must be free to report complaints to the SEC without any interference. Those drafting or using confidentiality agreements need to ensure that they do not include provisions that impede potential whistleblowers. For several years, JPMorgan forced clients into an untenable position, making them choose between receiving settlements or credits from the firm and reporting potential securities law violations to the SEC. The $18 million penalty might sound substantial, but context matters. JPMorgan Chase reported net income of $14.4 billion just in the third quarter of 2025 alone. An $18 million fine for systematically silencing potential whistleblowers for 3 years represents approximately 0.13% of one quarter's profits. That's a rounding error for a bank this size. This is the cost of doing business, not a meaningful deterrent. The pattern extends beyond just silencing whistleblowers. In October 2024, the Securities and Exchange Commission charged JPMorgan affiliates in 5 separate enforcement actions for failures including misleading disclosures to investors, breach of fiduciary duty, prohibited joint transactions, and failures to make recommendations in the best interests of customers. The combined penalties and voluntary payments totaled more than $151 million. One of these enforcement actions involved $4.3 billion in prohibited joint transactions. In March 2020, JPMorgan Investment Management caused $4.3 billion in prohibited joint transactions that advantaged an affiliated foreign money market fund over 3 U.S. money market mutual funds it advised. $4.3 billion. The number is almost incomprehensible. This wasn't a small operational error. This was billions of dollars moved in ways that violated Section 17D of the Investment Company Act. Additionally, between July 2019 and March 2021, JPMorgan engaged in or caused 65 prohibited principal trades with a combined notional value of approximately $8.2 billion. Principal trades are generally prohibited to avoid undisclosed conflicts of interest unless certain conditions are met. JPMorgan apparently decided those conditions didn't really matter. $8.2 billion in potentially conflicted transactions. The scale of these violations suggests they weren't accidental. These were systematic practices embedded in how the firm operated. Acting Director of Enforcement Sanjay Wadhwa captured the essence of the problem. JPMorgan's conduct across multiple business lines violated various laws designed to protect investors from the risks of self-dealing and conflicts of interest. Multiple business lines, multiple violations. This wasn't one rogue trader or one bad department. This was institutional. What makes the current whistleblower allegations about capital requirements even more alarming is that JPMorgan has been down this road before. In 2012, the bank suffered trading losses exceeding $6.2 billion in what became known as the London Whale scandal. The bank's chief investment office had built up massive positions in credit derivatives, supposedly to hedge risk, but actually creating enormous new risks. By May 2012, the synthetic credit portfolio had lost $2 billion. By June, losses jumped to $4.4 billion. By year-end, the total reached at least $6.2 billion. The episode resulted in congressional investigations, a scathing 300-page report by the U.S. Senate's Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, and $920 million in fines. Senator Carl Levin, then chairman of that subcommittee, pulled no punches in his assessment. The bank's chief investment office had misvalued its positions, hidden losses, dodged regulatory oversight, and disregarded risk limits. Essentially, JPMorgan traders placed increasingly risky bets using the bank's own money, and when those bets went south, they tried to cover up the magnitude of the disaster. The parallels to the current situation are striking. Once again, we have allegations of JPMorgan using accounting techniques to minimize apparent risk. Once again, we have questions about whether regulators are effectively overseeing the bank's activities. Once again, we have a whistleblower alleging that the bank's practices don't align with the rules meant to constrain it. Jamie Dimon, JPMorgan's chief executive officer since 2005, has long cultivated an image as a prudent banker who learned the lessons of 2008. In public appearances, Dimon often emphasizes the importance of strong capital and conservative risk management. Yet in 2023, Dimon said something revealing. We've got our smartest people figuring out every angle to reduce capital requirements for JP Morgan. Every angle. That's an interesting choice of words. It suggests an institutional focus, not on how much capital the bank needs to be truly safe, but rather on how little capital the bank can get away with holding while technically complying with regulations. There's a fundamental tension here between the letter of the law and its spirit. After 2008, regulators tried to create rules that would prevent another crisis. Those rules required big banks to hold substantial capital cushions. But if banks can use creative accounting to minimize those requirements, the rules become hollow. You end up with regulatory theater. It looks like banks are being constrained, but the constraints aren't actually binding. Former Treasury official Graham Steele's warning echoes here. If banks don't have enough capital when financial stress hits, their ability to absorb losses is eroded, putting entire economies at greater risk. That's not theoretical. That's exactly what happened in 2008 when over-leveraged banks collapsed, credit markets froze, and millions of people lost their jobs and homes. The banking industry's argument is that capital requirements are already too stringent, and that forcing banks to hold more capital reduces lending and hurts economic growth. There's some theoretical merit to this view. Capital sitting in reserves can't be loaned out to businesses or consumers, but this argument conveniently ignores what happens when undercapitalized banks fail during crises. The economic damage from bank failures and financial panics dwarfs any marginal reduction in lending from higher capital requirements. Just ask anyone who lived through 2008. The question isn't whether capital requirements impose any costs. Obviously they do. The question is whether those costs are worth the benefits of financial stability. Every serious economic analysis suggests they are. What makes the current situation particularly frustrating is that we're not dealing with genuinely new or surprising risks. The vulnerabilities in the financial system are well documented. The solutions, higher capital requirements, better risk management, stronger regulatory oversight, are well understood. We know what needs to be done. But implementing those solutions requires political will, and political will is exactly what the banking industry spends billions of dollars trying to undermine through lobbying. The result is a financial system that remains far more fragile than most people realize. This brings us back to the whistleblower's core allegation. If JP Morgan and other major banks are understating their complexity through practices like internal operational elimination, the entire edifice of post-crisis financial regulation might be built on false assumptions. Regulators think banks are holding adequate capital based on reported complexity scores. But if those scores are artificially depressed, actual capital cushions could be dangerously thin. We won't know until the next crisis hits, and by then, it will be too late. The story is still developing, and many questions remain unanswered. Will the Federal Reserve conduct a thorough investigation into the whistleblower's allegations? Will other regulators, perhaps the Securities and Exchange Commission or the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, take up the matter? Will Congress hold hearings to examine whether banks are gaming capital requirements? Will other whistleblowers come forward with additional evidence? The answers to these questions will determine whether this becomes a turning point in financial regulation or just another scandal that fades from public consciousness while nothing fundamentally changes. What's certain is that the stakes couldn't be higher. America's financial system remains dominated by a handful of enormous institutions. JPMorgan Chase alone holds $4.6 trillion in assets. That's roughly 20% of America's annual gross domestic product concentrated in a single institution. Bank of America, Wells Fargo, and Citigroup add trillions more. If any of these institutions failed, the ripple effects would be catastrophic. The entire premise of too big to fail banks is that they're supposed to be managed conservatively precisely because their failure would be so devastating. Extra capital requirements are part of that conservative management. They're the price these institutions pay for being permitted to grow so large. But if banks view capital requirements as obstacles to be minimized rather than as essential safety measures, we have a serious problem. It suggests a fundamental mismatch between regulatory intent and institutional culture. Regulators want banks to be safe. Banks want to maximize returns. Those goals aren't necessarily compatible. The entire regulatory framework depends on banks not just complying with the letter of rules, but embracing their underlying purpose, which is financial stability. When institutions treat regulations as puzzles to be solved rather than constraints to be respected, the system becomes dangerous. That's what makes whistleblowers so important. They're often the only people with inside knowledge who are willing to come forward and say the emperor has no clothes. They see practices that look wrong, that violate the spirit, if not always the letter of rules, and they risk their careers to sound the alarm. The fact that JP Morgan allegedly retaliated against this particular whistleblower by laying them off in 2022 tells you something about institutional priorities. When someone raises concerns about potentially problematic practices, the response shouldn't be to shoot the messenger. It should be to seriously investigate whether the concerns have merit. If major banks are holding less capital than they should be, that's a problem right now, today, that needs to be addressed before the next downturn arrives. Financial markets are cyclical. There will be another recession. There will be another period of market stress. The question is whether our banking system is adequately prepared to withstand those stresses without requiring government intervention. If banks have been gaming their capital calculations, the answer might be no.